Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Olinsky, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Structural Reform and Governance here at the Center for American Progress. We're thrilled you're joining us for today's event looking at attacks on the freedom of the press. It's part of our ongoing Democracy on the Line series, which has been examining a wide range of abuses and attacks on the rule of law by the Trump administration. Videos of past events are available on our website if you're interested. After I offer some quick thoughts, we'll turn to a truly all-star panel with some time for questions from you all. But first, let me start by underscoring the gravity of the moment we are in. The Trump administration is waging an unprecedented assault on the freedom of the press, an assault that would frankly look quite familiar to authoritarians across the globe. This Trump administration appears to be on a mission to alter reality, or at least the reporting of it, to conform to its own lies and dystopian game plan to create an imperial presidency. And they are feeling the pressure. As its popularity and programs suffer from deep disapproval from the American people, and as the midterm elections near, the administration is trying to stifle and criminalize criticism so they can hang on to power at all costs. They must understand what our nation's founders understood. Without a vibrant and free press, it becomes almost impossible for everyday Americans to be informed about the facts and to hold elected officials accountable. And when our government starts arresting journalists for covering news events, no one is safe. None of us. So how did we arrive at this point? Perhaps the most striking action the administration took against the news media in the past few weeks was arresting and indicting independent journalists Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. These journalists were doing their jobs, reporting live from a protest at a church in Minneapolis, a protest related to the brutal crackdown by federal immigration agents that resulted in the killings of 2 Americans in broad daylight. But that's not all. These arrests came days after FBI agents executed an unprecedented search warrant and seized multiple electronic devices from the home of Hannah Nathanson, a Washington Post reporter who regularly reports about the federal government. Experts say this is the first time in U.S. history that the government has searched a reporter's home in an investigation related to an alleged national security media leak. The administration's extraordinary abuses of power come after a year of the president and his team systematically targeting reporters and media companies who dare to report the facts. It smacks of the same kind of naked retaliation and strongman tactics seen in regimes overseas. Here are just some of the tactics that go beyond the arrests and search I just mentioned. The president's meritless lawsuits against media outlets that he dislikes for billions of dollars, while his allies take over media companies and censor the news to support his lies. The defunding of public broadcasting. The dangerous demonization of the mainstream media as enemies of the people. Decisions by the White House and the Pentagon to cut off access by journalists who haven't conformed to the administration's version of reality. And last, the weaponization of the FCC, which, in the words of Republican Senator Ted Cruz, has used mob-like actions to punish disfavored media companies and suppress the voices of critics of the administration. We're seeing that in real time this week with Stephen Colbert's interview with James Tallarico. These abuses of power are driving our democracy off a cliff. Our nation's founders designed the First Amendment to prevent this very thing from happening. As Thomas Jefferson told us, the liberty of the American people depends on a free press. Journalists play an indispensable role to uncover and report the facts to people about important events without fear or favor. That is what Don Lemon and Georgia Fort and Hannah Nathanson were doing with the First Amendment as their beacon. The administration's abuses of law appear designed not only to stop specific reporters from continuing their work, but to be a force multiplier that sends a message to all the media. If you report negative news about us, you risk government retribution. And as we know, retribution against perceived political enemies across civil society is a hallmark of the Trump administration, of the president's Department of Justice and other federal agencies, which he has weaponized into his own personal police force. I know, I sound very gloom and doom here, but I am not without some optimism. There actually are ways to try to force a course correction. First, the journalists I discussed are already waging court battles against the government's dangerous overreach, represented by some of the most fearless litigators in the country. Second, civil society, including leading nonprofit organizations, have banded together to help inform Americans about the government's abuses of the news media and to provide a bulwark for journalists under attack. And third, Many career prosecutors and even some Trump appointees have quit their jobs rather than follow orders to prosecute Trump's perceived enemies. And perhaps most importantly, everyday Americans are flexing their power. Across the political spectrum, people are saying enough is enough. As we see from the brave actions by people in Minneapolis and beyond, when Americans peacefully organize and mass mobilize against government overreach, it becomes very hard for the government to ignore their demands. And as we like to say at CAP, courage is contagious. So with that, I want to turn things over to our star-studded panel, which will be moderated by Jen White, the acclaimed host of NPR's 1A show. Jen herself is a longtime reporter who has a track record of bravely speaking truth to power. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you. Please take it away.
Ben, thank you. And thanks to the Center for American Progress for the invitation to moderate this important discussion about press freedom. If you scroll social media, or you run into that particular neighbor while you're out on a walk, you might find yourself in a discussion about free speech. They may argue that the First Amendment gives us the right to say whatever we want, to whomever we want, whenever and wherever we want to say it. But the First Amendment is specific. In case we need reminding, it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It speaks specifically to government prohibitions on speech, the press, assembly, and our ability to hold the government accountable for its actions. The First Amendment is a cornerstone of our democracy. But over the last 14 months, the Trump administration has leveraged the lectern, social media, funding, the courts, the FCC, and the DOJ to attack the press. Still, the reporting continues. But what's at stake for our country and our citizenry in the face of these attacks on press freedom? And how do we ensure this essential cornerstone doesn't crumble? Well, I'm happy to welcome our panelists today. Jennifer Rubin is co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. She's also a former Washington Post columnist. She's often been on the receiving end of Trump's attacks. Jennifer, it's great to see you. Also with us is Jim Acosta. He's an independent journalist and host of the Jim Acosta podcast. He's a former CNN chief White House correspondent and often, again, on the receiving end of Trump's attacks. Jim, it's great to see you. And Jamil Jaffer. He's executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Under his leadership, the Institute has filed precedent-setting litigation, undertaken major interdisciplinary research initiatives, and become an influential voice in debates about the freedoms of press and speech in the digital age. Jamil, thanks for joining us. I want to just build on what we heard from Ben a moment ago by hearing from each of you why a free press is fundamental to a healthy democracy. Jennifer, I'll come to you first.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be on the panel with two such esteemed colleagues. There was a reason why the founders put the press in the First Amendment. It's the only civil entity that is mentioned in our Constitution, actually. And that's because they deeply believed that in a democratic society, an informed citizenry is critical. And the press is one important means by which we do hold our government accountable. It's a telltale sign of authoritarian regimes throughout history and around the globe that the first target is often a free press. The aim, of course, is to control the free flow of information. And whether it's universities, whether it's a display at the Independence Center, which was just a subject of litigation in Philadelphia, whether it is journalists, either in traditional media or new media, a regime that attempts to control what people know and what people think is going to, by definition, go after independent journalists. And that they have done, as you and Ben have outlined. So I think it is both a symptom of where we are in terms of our democratic threat, and also it does speak to the power of the press, the power of what we do, that we have made ourselves a target for the Trump regime.
Jim?
Well, thank you for having me, and I'll echo what Jen said about getting us all together here. A great group of folks. My sense of it is that we cannot exist. We cannot continue to exist as a country if we do not have a free press. And it seems to me right now what we're seeing happen across this country, just to cut to the chase, and I talk about this on my show all the time, is that I believe Donald Trump has cracked the code in how to hurt the media in this country through these lawsuit settlements, which I would describe as bribes, through the use of the FCC as sort of henchmen, speech henchmen, and going after Stephen Colbert, or even the arrest of Don Lemon. I mean, if we've now reached the arresting journalist phase of Donald Trump's authoritarian project, we're in a lot of trouble. But all of this adds up to what I see myself as part of. This is an all-out assault on our free speech rights in this country. And until it's stopped, until we, some of us get together and push back on this, it's going to continue, and it's just going to get much, much worse. And it just seems to me that we're sort of we're catching on to it. I would say maybe a year ago this time, I would say we're sort of sleepwalking through this. We've got our heads in the ground a little bit. I think people are waking up to what is occurring. The question is whether we're now moving further ahead than what we can, put the toothpaste back in the tube. I mean, if you look at what Vladimir Putin did in Russia in the early days of, his reign, he went right after the press. He went after comedians. He went after media. And we're starting to see some of the same steps being taken by this administration now. And it's something that, it's going to take all of us. And we can take off our so-called objective journalist hats to call it out. I mean, there's nothing Democratic or Republican in standing up for free speech and freedom of the press.
Jamil, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jen, and great to be here with Jennifer and Jim. So the press play a really important role in our democracy in that they inform the public. And, if we're going to have a society in which the public is sovereign, the citizens are sovereign over the government, which is the whole idea of our system, the public needs to be informed. And the press plays that role. Sorry. So if you have, journalists who can go out there and gather information about government policy, about the implications of government policy, can inform the public about government decisions, then the public can play the role that it's supposed to play and hold government officials accountable. Ask government officials hard questions about the decisions they're making, and ultimately ensure that the people who are representing us are actually doing their jobs. And all of that sort of requires the press to play its constitutionally appointed role. I think that there's this tendency to think of the press as the ultimate target of President Trump's attacks. But I think that the ultimate target of these attacks is actually the Democratic public. The press are proxies for the public, and the government, when it attacks the press, is attacking the Democratic public. That's the way to think about these arrests of journalists like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. It's the way to think about the exclusion of the Associated Press from the White House press pool. It's not about the AP. It's not about Don Lemon. It's about whether we can have an informed public, a public that is empowered to ensure that government, that the people who are leading us are actually doing the job we want them to do.
Before we continue, I just want to mention we will have some time for questions and answers at the end of our discussion. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions, and I encourage you to do so. There's a lot of research that shows Americans' erosion of trust in media, and it's been happening over decades. Some of that is earned. There's been much discussion about whether newsrooms are representative of the communities they serve, whether we've always done a good enough job in covering underrepresented communities accurately and with humanity. But some of that breakdown is deliberately crafted. Jennifer and Jim, you've both been on the receiving end of President Trump's attacks. How have you seen this question about trust in the media weaponized by the Trump administration? And Jim, I'd love for you to start by building on what you were just saying about the Trump administration cracking the code on how to attack the press.
Yeah, I mean, and Jamil was talking about this as well when he mentioned the White House going after the Associated Press. I mean, that was because the Associated Press would not refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, which is an insane thing. I mean, it's just patently, objectively crazy. And, we have to think a little bit more comfortable calling this stuff out as journalists. I think there's a lot of tiptoeing through the tulips and, oh, goodness, if we say things as they are, we'll just feed right into the narrative that we're out to get Trump and we're biased against him and all these sorts of things. No, a dictator is a dictator, an authoritarian is an authoritarian. Somebody who's cracking down on the free press is cracking down on the free press. It's just balls and strikes. The sky is blue, the grass is green, and so on. And to pick up on the point about cracking the code, I mean, what is happening is not just the administration using the arms of government and going after news organizations and the media companies that control them. They're getting the willful cooperation of these companies. The lawyers at CBS are harassing Stephen Colbert over who he puts on his show, over putting James Tallarico on his show and saying, well, you have to, remember the fairness doctrine. We have to have the fairness doctrine. And that means you have to have the other candidates. Well, Stephen Colbert's already had Jasmine Crockett on his show. And so, all they can do is put out these ridiculous arguments to justify their own cowardice. And so some of this is on us, and some of it's on the journalists who work in these news organizations and the executives who run these companies. And I think hard decisions are going to have to be made. The people who run these companies are going to just, at some point, they're just going to have to make a choice. Are you with the Constitution, or are you just going to go along with this? And if you're just going to go along with this, you just need to understand that you have to live with these decisions the rest of your lives. And are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable being, taking in your last breaths and saying, I capitulated. I bowed down to the dictator. I mean, I think that is a question that a lot of people have to ask. And as for eroding trust in newsrooms and news organizations and so on, we're at now, I mean, I remember when Donald Trump called me fake news at that press conference in January of 2017. That was 9 years ago. I was out on the campaign trail with him in 2016 when he would call us the rotten news media and so on, before he called us fake news, the enemy of the people. We're now 10 years into Trump demonizing the press. So I think we have to have some understanding that public attitudes about the press are going to be affected by all of that. There's just no question about it. And so it's going to take years to get people out of this mode where they just don't trust the media because Donald Trump says you can't trust the media and so on. No, it's the guy that has lied more than 30,000 times and is jailing journalists and going after news organizations. That's the person who can't be trusted. And I think we just have to be more comfortable in saying that. There's too much reluctance in calling this stuff out, it seems to me.
Well, what's interesting, Jennifer, is covering this administration, Jim referred to calling balls and strikes. There are so many of the Trump administration's actions that are outside of what we would consider normal politics, normal rhetoric, that even when you call balls and strikes, some of the American public is just deeply uncomfortable because it's so unfamiliar. It feels like that can't be real. He couldn't have said that. And then you couple that with the disinformation online. And as journalists, we end up, even if you're just calling the balls and strikes and saying what he's said, quoting him directly, to some people, it sounds like an attack. And that's something that the president is then able to weaponize. So how are you seeing journalists trying to navigate that quagmire right now?
Well, to pick up on what Jim was saying, part of the problem has been that journalists have not recognized, and I'm speaking about the legacy media in particular, the moment that we're in. When we had two functional small d Democratic parties, you could go to each side and get a quote. This Democratic representative says X, this Republican representative says Y. But when you have one party that has morphed into a cult of personality, an authoritarian supportive movement, then to treat them as a normal alternative source of information is simply to indulge and enable the authoritarian regime. And so I think it is this fear of seeming like we're taking sides that frankly has led to the erosion of the support and the trust in the media. We know that the phrase, now sane washing. We know the kind of soft peddling. We know the difference between the press spending weeks and months on President Biden's age, which was an appropriate topic, and the almost pathological fear of talking about Donald Trump's mental condition and emotional status. We know that some of what he does is not just unique, it's not just testing the limits. These are all phrases that you see that have become conventions. He makes an argument, we say, well, he's actually ranting and raving like a lunatic. And by saying and couching it in terms that make him sound like a normal politician, they've only enabled him and I think damaged their own credibility. And, this thing is a powerful thing. Everybody has one now, a telephone as I'm holding it up. And once they begin to use it and they can see reality for themselves, they know who's being authentic and relating reality and who's not. And that's, I think, the fault line here. And that's the handicap that the regime operates under. And that is, we still retain a measure of freedom that allows people to see behind the screen, that allows people to see the wizard operating the dials and spinning the wheels. We see what has happened in Minneapolis. And I think one of the reasons that was such a inflection point is we could compare what the administration was saying, which was so patently absurd, untrue, and what people could see with their own eyes. And in describing what people can see with their own eyes, I think that's the road to retaining credibility and journalistic integrity. I left the Washington Post. Jim left CNN because what we saw was a pattern of capitulation, of obedience in advance. That's why I founded the Contrarian. That's why Jim is now in the independent media space. And we have to, I think, recognize that part of the credibility problem has been created by corporate-owned media. And we all operated, at least I operated, under this illusion that if you had a really big corporation that owned a media entity, well, then they would be immune to pressure. They could stand up to the administration. Disney was bigger and could defend ABC. And in fact, it turned out to be the exact opposite. They're the most cowardly people. They feel like they have the most to lose. They have other business interests that supersede their obligations as journalistic entities. And so they've compromised themselves. They've embarrassed themselves in many instances. And that has damaged the media. I would also say that when we say trust in the media, we have to define what we mean by the media. The media is such a broad thing. The media is those people with the phones who go on and post their information on TikTok or on Instagram. It's what Jim and I are doing in independent media. It's what Fox News does, which is wildly different than what CNN does. So to say that we lost trust in media, well, I don't trust Fox News. I'll say it right here. And other people will pick their parts of the media that they don't trust. So I think our job is to call it like we see it, to not be trapped by this paradigm of on the one hand, on the other hand, and to be as clear and as forceful as we can. And frankly, as members of the press, to take a side. And we take the side of democracy. We take the side of the free press. It makes no sense for the media, which is the first to be repressed, to be indifferent to the fate of the democratic experiment. And when we, I think, embrace that, then that is both freeing and the road back to recovery and earning back the trust of the American people.
Jamil, I want to talk a bit more about the media landscape right now. The Medill state of local news reports shows that 50 million Americans have limited access to local news now. There's been, as Jennifer just said, increased media consolidation across print and broadcast. In a recent Reuters survey, 54% of respondents say they get their news from social media. That's compared to 50% who say they turn to television. And that social media space is dominated by influencers who can be used by politicians to promote their agendas and their messages. So I'm curious to hear from you what complications, but also perhaps what opportunities that shifting landscape present to us to push back on any administration's attempts to limit press freedom.
So let me first just address or pick up something that Jennifer mentioned. So I think it's true that if you look across the legacy media, you see over and over again sort of capitulation to the Trump administration and just surrender to the Trump administration's threats. That's the norm. There are some exceptions. I mean, I mentioned the Associated Press exclusion from the press pool earlier. AP is suing. The New York Times has defended itself against feeble defamation suits. The Wall Street Journal has also defended itself against Trump's feeble lawsuits. But the rule is surrender. You saw that with CBS. You saw that with the ABC settlement. You saw it with the cancellation, although then reversed, of Jimmy Kimmel's show. I think you see it with the cancellation of Stephen Colbert's show. That is the rule, and that rule actually transcends media organizations. It's not just about media organizations. The irony is that the institutions in our society that are nominally the most powerful, the wealthiest institutions, the most influential institutions, those are the ones that have been surrendering. That's true with the universities. It's true with law firms. The biggest law firms in the country, the people who make a living by going to court and fighting, they surrendered to the Trump administration. And this, I think, is the reason I bring this up, even though our conversation is about the press specifically, is that I think it's important to recognize that the pattern transcends the press. The pattern, is across our society. And so if we're looking for solutions here, I think we have to look beyond the media landscape. We have to think about, why is it that all of these nominally powerful institutions seemingly feel so vulnerable to governmental attacks of the kind that the Trump administration is now making every day. And
I think you come up with a why, Jamil? Have you
well,
found the why?
I won't pretend to have a full answer to the question, but my answer reflects my own my own position in this landscape. I see the First Amendment as part of the problem, the weakness of First Amendment doctrine relating to what is sometimes called jawboning. The informal coercion that the Trump administration has now made a practice of bringing to bear on the media, on universities, on cultural institutions, on law firms. That kind of informal pressure is actually really hard to get at with contemporary First Amendment doctrine. And the Trump administration has all of these levers, even beyond, going a little bit beyond jawboning, like federal funding, for example, for universities, or the White House press pool, or access to the Pentagon for journalists. All of these levers that previous administrations also had, but for the most part, previous administrations didn't exploit them, or didn't exploit them anyway to the same extent. And now the Trump administration is just picking up all of these tools that have been sitting unused, or at least partially unused, and using them to their full extent. And I think First Amendment doctrine has to adjust in recognition of the ways in which these tools are now being used. But part of it, I think, also has to do with when people think about the values that the First Amendment was supposed to instill or protect, they usually point to truth-seeking and autonomy and self-government. And my institute, the Knight First Amendment Institute, usually starts with self-government and democracy. And our view is that those values are the ones that the First Amendment was most supposed to protect. But when Justice Brandeis talked about the First Amendment, he often talked about instilling a kind of civic courage, instilling in ordinary citizens the ability to hear ideas that they disagree with, the ability to respond to them on the merits, the ability to fulfill a particular function in the democratic process. Actually considering government policy, criticizing government policy, criticizing governmental decisions, and then holding officials accountable for their decisions. You need a particular kind of civic character to play that role. And Justice Brandeis thought, well, part of the point of the First Amendment is to make sure that Americans are the kinds of people who are worthy of this democracy. And when I see all these leaders of the most powerful institutions in America surrendering to Trump rather than resisting, basically declining to assert their First Amendment rights, I wonder whether, maybe we failed. Maybe the First Amendment has failed to instill in Americans enough of a willingness to defend these freedoms and play the role that the Constitution envisioned for them.
Well,
I don't think I answered your question, but
I want to read a comment we got from Ahu, who says, we had a very similar but very long process in Turkey. My humble advice may be form clusters, do not work isolated, get courts to stay independent. They will be crucial. Get lawyers to push back. Corporations will surrender. Citizens should be on your side. And so, Jim and Jennifer, briefly, when we talk about building this civic muscle, if you will, that Jamil was just talking about. Jim, how do you see your role as a journalist in helping build a more informed, empowered citizenry?
Well, I continue to do what I used to do at my old place, as I call it now. I do believe in holding their feet to the fire, but I also think that it's healthy and right for us to hold these news organizations and the companies that own them and their feet to the fire. I mean, right now, Paramount appears to be moving in the direction of being able to gobble up Warner Brothers Discovery, which includes CNN, in addition to owning CBS. This would be a consolidation of media in this country that we haven't seen in a very long time. And it would be under the umbrella of, or under the thumb, as maybe a better way of putting it, of very Trumpy right-wing zealots. And, 60 Minutes has apparently lost Anderson Cooper. Just recently, 60 Minutes tried to sideline a piece on CICOT, the El Salvadoran gulag. As I tell folks all the time, when 60 Minutes is in trouble, we're all in trouble. And so we're going to have to figure out a way out of this. My sense of it right now is that independent journalists have to start teaming up with one another to sort of form a NATO alliance for the truth. I do a lot of collaborating with Jen and the Contrarian. I'm pestering Norm all the time to come on and give his legal perspective on things. And I've spoken with Heather Cox Richardson about this too, about building independent news communities. I also think if we're in the solution space, we need to talk about building up public broadcasting to a point where it's too big to fail, too big to mess with, and that it's run by people in a board of sorts that is intricately designed in a way that a different administration, a different Congress can't come in with a wrecking ball and smash it like the East Wing of the White House. And so we're just going to have to build a better mousetrap, it seems to me, in the days ahead, because corporate ownership of these precious news organizations and the way we inform people in this country, I'm sorry, folks, Trump broke it. And, maybe when he's gone, it'll all go back to normal again and the genie will go back in the bottle. But my guess is it won't. And that these, the Ellisons have taken over TikTok. That's another thing that's coming down the pike. And so it's getting into our kids' phones and into their hands and into their minds. We're going to have to figure out how to fix this fast, or else the United States of America, and I've already started to describe this as we're living under a state compromised media system in this country. It's not a free press. If the FCC can block James Tallarico from the Stephen Colbert show, it's just not. So, the first step in the process, I think, is just acknowledging reality, and then we can move on from there.
Jennifer, how do you see your role?
I think to pick up on both what Jamil and Jim said, we have to look at how authoritarian regimes bring people to heel. In virtually every authoritarian regime, large institutions, powerful institutions, corporations in particular, capitulate and enable. They cut deals. Churches cut deals. Large corporations cut deals. We all know how fascists come to power. They cut deals by raising the specter of communism or the left. And unfortunately, once media became a captive of corporate media, they no longer had the wherewithal to resist. They became part of the problem. They became part of the enabling structure. So when we see that Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, has begun to really destroy a media institution, a fine newspaper that has a heralded history, it's not because necessarily the First Amendment is broken. It's because we have large concentrations of wealth in this country, and those large concentrations of wealth and those billionaire owners have seized up and gobbled up media institutions, which are then used for their own purposes. And so media has been compromised by the Jeff Bezoses, by the Disneys, by large for-profit organizations. And to echo what Jim says, we need a better model. Part of that is in nonprofit journalism, public journalism, ProPublica, for example, and some of the other non-for-profit. Part of it is in independent media. Part of it is in, I think, letting foundations own and operate newspapers. But there is a serious problem. And one of the most serious problems you alluded to early on, Jen, was the disappearance, the news deserts that we've created out in the country where local news has evaporated. And the Sinclairs, this enormous right-wing media behemoth, has gobbled up local news stations, so that there is a dearth of local reporting, local accountability. And frankly, that is in many instances, as Jamil knows from study after study, the most trusted journalism is the people who are embedded in communities.
And there's also a very close link between having access to local journalism and civic engagement. There's a direct
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think we have to really rethink these things. But I also think that we have to recognize that the ordinary American is far ahead of many of the elites and many of these institutions. When we see the kind of response we saw in Minneapolis, when you see 7 million people in the street, that tells me that there is greater civic courage in individuals and in decentralized institutions, in cities, in smaller entities than there is in large corporations and large media conglomerates. And that gives me hope. That gives me great encouragement. And I would also say that although, and I have made this case as strenuously as anyone as a recovering lawyer, that law firms have been miserable in capitulating, and many universities have. There have also been universities that have not capitulated, and law firms that have defended other law firms, and law firms that have now stepped forward to defend dissenters. But the problem is not going to be solved easily or quickly. And when you have a United States attorney for the District of Columbia try to indict a United States senator and his colleagues for making a video informing members of the military that they have an obligation to follow the Constitution, Jeanine Pirro went to a grand jury to indict people for pure speech. You realize that we have a serious, serious problem. And I would just say the same force that gives me optimism because of the people in the street in Minneapolis, one of the great institutions of democracy, which we are coming to appreciate, are grand juries and the number of Americans who will not indict, who will not go along with retribution and partisan indictments. So I think we have a long way to go. It's going to take some creative thinking about how media reinvents itself. And there's going to have to be some accountability for those large corporations and media entities that have enabled authoritarianism.
Jamil, I'd like to hear about some of the work your organization is doing legally to push back on First Amendment abuses.
Yeah, sure. I mean, let me start just with the press pool and the Pentagon, since I already mentioned those. So, one big question, and Jim knows this very well, is what is the First Amendment status of these spaces in which journalists get information from governmental sources and then analyze it and share it out to the public. And President Trump has been arguing that the White House press pool is effectively part of his office, and he can decide who has access to his office. Who he can have access. He can decide who has access to the information he provides there. And it's just like giving an exclusive interview to Fox News. He can decide which journalists have that special access to governmental information. And the argument that we have been making now, I think in 3 different amicus briefs filed in support of the Associated Press, is that the White House press pool is a public forum under First Amendment doctrine, meaning that the government might be able to exclude reporters from that space for content neutral reasons, but it can't exclude them on the basis of their viewpoints alone. You can't kick out a news organization because it doesn't say Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. The same or a version of the same thing is happening at the Pentagon now, where the Pentagon is demanding that journalists sign on to a pledge that basically says, we won't ask government officials for secret information if we're given access to the space. And no journalist, no self-respecting journalist is going to sign a pledge that says that, because asking government officials for secret information is the job of a journalist, right? One interesting thing about these particular legal disputes is that they are actually a mirror image of the disputes that arose during the first Trump administration around the president's social media accounts. Because you may remember that President Trump had a practice of blocking people from his Twitter account after they criticized him or criticized his policies. My institute went to court and we won this case against President Trump, holding that a government official's social media account is a public forum, or can be a public forum for First Amendment purposes, meaning that the president can't exclude people or can't block people simply because they've criticized him or criticized his policies. And so the same legal fight is now unfolding around these, the White House press pool and the Pentagon. The other, or another set of issues has to do with the circumstances in which the government has the authority to demand reporters' sources. And this has been, a battle for many decades now, in part because the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in on this since the 1970s. And the case in which the Supreme Court weighed in is kind of notoriously vague and cryptic. So since there is no First Amendment doctrine protecting journalists have had to rely on legislatures and on the executive. The protections have all come from the legislatures or from the executive. State legislatures have done their job and passed statutes that protect journalists from compulsory process, from compulsory demands that they disclose their sources. But Congress hasn't. There was an act that had a lot of support called the Press Act that we and other press freedom organizations really had hoped would pass under the last Congress, but it didn't. The result is that there's still no federal legislation protecting journalists from compulsory disclosure of their sources. The only protections come from the executive branch. That was okay under President Biden, who, to his credit, passed or promulgated the most protective rules of any presidential administration so far. But those were all they all turned on the grace of the executive. And now we have a different president, and President Trump doesn't have the same interest in protecting journalists or protecting press freedom. And the result is that journalists have essentially no protection at all. And right at the beginning of this event, we started by mentioning Heather Nathanson's the search of Heather Nathanson's home and the seizure of her phones and laptops. And I think that is pretty directly traceable to the rescission of the protections that President Biden had put in place and President Trump has now effectively erased.
Well, I want to get to some of the questions that are coming in, and we only have roughly 10 minutes here, so I'll just ask you to keep your answers brief so we can get to as many as possible. We got this from Suzanne, who wants to know, are there any comments on the deep cuts by Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post? Jennifer, I think you spoke about that briefly, but Jim, anything to add?
I had Ashley Parker and Jonathan Capehart, wonderful people, former Washington Post journalists, on my show the other day, and Ashley wrote a piece in The Atlantic that I would point people to. I think she described it as Jeff Bezos murdering the Washington Post. I grew up in the DC area. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I remember my mom, putting it out on the kitchen table every morning and reading it front to back. And, it's a beloved institution. It's just awful to see what's happened to it. And it's another, I think, cautionary tale about what happens. Jen and Jonathan and Ashley both talked about how there were all these high hopes when Jeff Bezos first came in, and they thought he was going to be this benevolent billionaire, and that he was, thank goodness we found somebody with deep pockets who can fund all this wonderful journalism and so on. And then, by the way, Donald Trump comes into office and they're all, bending the knee. And it just goes to show you that the system that we have for delivering information to people in this country is badly broken. And the way we have newspapers operated in this country is badly broken. And it's just going to take, I think, a new way in the years ahead. And it may just be more public media, more independent media. I describe it on my show as, the old line from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. At some point, these independent institutions are going to join forces and form larger institutions that will rival these compromised corporate media structures.
We got this from Jeanette, who asks, how much can we rely on the courts to protect journalists against Trump's attacks? Jamil, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question because there are places in which First Amendment doctrine is actually quite strong. The public forum doctrine is real, and we can enforce it in court. I think that the bigger threats, I would say, are the ones that we were referencing earlier in this conversation. They don't have to do with sort of direct legal attacks. They have to do with the political economy of the media, just the way that the media is organized, and the feeling among the most powerful media organizations in the country that it's in their interest to cater to the Trump administration's ideological desires, and that's actually a lot harder to figure out how to address. Like, there's no lawsuit you can file to force CBS to do the journalism that it should be doing. The solution to that problem, I think, is a lot more complicated, and it's going to have to involve reorganization somehow of the media landscape. Jen, can I just make one sort of related point very quickly, which is, sure. I feel obliged to make this point as a Canadian. Where I grew up in Canada, there were these laws that required Canadian broadcasters to carry Canadian content. And the reason they had those laws was that they were terrified that otherwise, if they didn't have those laws, Canadian culture would be overwhelmed by American content, and Canada's distinctive culture would just disappear. We don't have those kinds of laws in the United States because we're not scared, and we shouldn't be, of our culture being overwhelmed by European culture or even Chinese culture. But we have the opposite problem here, which is that we live in a kind of bubble. Like, we don't have access to ideas from abroad. We don't have access to information from abroad in the way that people in countries like Canada necessarily do. And I think that part of what we need to do, if we're ever in a position to rebuild, to kind of reimagine what the free speech landscape in this country should look like, I think we have to do a better job of guaranteeing Americans access to ideas and information from abroad.
We got this from Bill, who says, I frequently served as a U.S. Embassy spokesperson during my career in the Foreign Service and was often struck by how journalists in other countries regarded the American media as role models and admired the freedom with which they operated. This has had a positive impact on journalism practice around the world. Am I justified in my fears that other governments are likely to use what Trump is doing to rationalize cracking down on their own media? Jennifer, your thoughts?
Absolutely. And this is true in so many different respects. We are a role model, whether it's freedom of the press, whether it is simply a rules-based society, whether it is respecting the results of elections, that we have been a model for much of the world, and that when we fall down, other actors, authoritarians will say, well, see, the United States doesn't believe in that either. And this is sort of the reverse of the kind of public diplomacy we used to use in the Cold War, where we held ourselves up as an example in opposition to the communist world, that here in America, journalists can be aggressive. Here in America, journalists can be free. And now we've kind of lowered ourselves and been lowered to their level. To pick up just very briefly on something that Jamil said, courts, I want to stress, have done a remarkably good job at the lower court level. We've just had two remarkable cases, one stemming, as I mentioned, from a display in Philadelphia that, strictly speaking, wasn't a First Amendment case, but did defend the right to have accurate history displayed in a public space. And the other was a decision, in essence, in defense of Mark Kelly, who, as I mentioned, was one of the senators who was persecuted, and the court again upheld his First Amendment rights. But we also have to remember that it is the threat of retribution. It's little consequence after you have had to expend the time, the energy, the emotional angst of having to defend oneself after the fact. And one of the things we have to look at as we rebuild the architecture is developing private rights of action, protections for constitutional rights for media organizations, for individuals, so that there is a deterrence, that they don't look at this in government as a free swing at the media, free swing at individuals, that there is accountability, at least financial accountability, for members of the administration, the government itself, when they seek to crush First Amendment rights.
Well, I'm going to combine a couple of questions we got here. Jeffrey says, how can journalists better organize and coordinate for a robust free press? And Bridget writes, Jen and Jim have both launched new platforms due to traditional outlets being increasingly risk averse. Can you talk about that? Have those platforms in your work been successful? What were the challenges? So we have just a few minutes left, but Jim, can you briefly walk us through it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought when I left my old place, I was just going to go on a trip around the world and spend some miles and hotel points and that sort of thing. And then, lo and behold, we had a lot of work to do as journalists. I mean, Donald Trump instantly pardoned all the January 6th rioters and insurrectionists and started going after the Associated Press. I mean, he started, having law firms cut these weird deals that we had never seen before. That Jen mentioned earlier, and it got me back to work. It got Jen back to work, and so we're doing the news. We're doing it in a different way. We're doing it in an independent way. And you look at the Contrarian; they have hundreds of thousands of subscribers on Substack. I have the same, and we're both growing on YouTube and all these other places. Don Lemon is doing this. Joy Reid is doing this. And then you also have, I think, a lot of people out there like ProPublica that Jen mentioned. There's some folks that are doing great work in media right now, and I think it's if there's something to be said for lifting up other voices, I think this may be the moment to do it. There's a lot that we could do in lifting up. Jen and I don't look at each other as rivals at all. We look at one another as folks who need to be lifted up, and a rising tide lifts all boats, and it brings everybody else up with us. And there's just so many people out there. We talk to them all the time who are just so terribly worried about what's happening in this country, and they see these big media organizations. I mean, my goodness, the four of us who are on this panel are not as old as some of the folks who are probably watching and listening and remember the days of Walter Cronkite. How jarring it must be to people our parents' age who came up with Walter Cronkite and what's happened at CBS. It's terrifying to a lot of people. And so it really has, I think, placed a lot of responsibility on some of us in this field to try to elevate this to a point where it gets going in the right direction. Because, if we leave it up to these corporate actors who are in league with the administration, the gentleman from Turkey who was asking the question, I mean, that's a sneak preview of coming attractions. We cannot go down that road. That's not America. It never has been America. And so to me, we have to continue to work together to lift each other up in this moment.
Jennifer, I want to hear from you briefly as well.
I would say one thing, and that is that the White House press corps, Jim knows this well, has to be much better about protecting one another. The treatment that women journalists in particular have gotten is shameful. And when he interrupts or insults one journalist, they can't simply go on to the next question. They have to go back again and again. And if he walks out or refuses then to answer the question, so be it. Yeah. But they have to stand in unison. They cannot allow him to pick off one against the other. That's just unacceptable. The other thing I would say in response to Jim is there is such a hunger out there for authentic, clear, independent voices. We were blown away. I was blown away. I thought I'd just be writing a little column and going about my own business like Jim. And hundreds of thousands of people have subscribed. And as you know, Jen, there is a great freedom in not having commercial interests at heart. You can have detailed, in-depth conversations. You can not necessarily be looking for the clicks and for the attention in each one. You can draw on the best experts. And I think what you will find in independent media, whether it's Paul Krugman, whether it's Jim Acosta, is some of the smartest, some of the most detailed, some of the most substantive journalism out there. And that gives me hope that there is an appetite for that. And we have to figure out how to increase the size and increase the scope in doing what we do.
Jamil, I'll give you the last word here as we wrap up. Just a final thought you want to leave us with, whether it's about our ability to act as individuals or act collectively to protect the free press.
Yeah, I mean, I spent so much of my time on this Zoom complaining about the capitulation of the big players. The obvious contrast is to what happened in places like Minnesota, where you had so many people out on the streets, the kind of solidarity that was expressed there, the sense of commitment to our collective future, sense of commitment to our democracy. It was inspiring. I know I'm not alone in having been inspired by that. And I think if there is a way out of this mess that we find ourselves in, that's it. That the spirit of that those people showed on the streets of Minneapolis, that's what we need more of.
Well, Jen, Jim, Jamil, thank you so much for this discussion, and thank you all for your excellent questions and thoughts. I wish we had more time so we could get to all of them, but clearly lots more to discuss, but a lot more we all can do as well. Again, thank you to the Center for American Progress for this discussion, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jen.